Hello and welcome to Escape from Mount Backlog, one man's quest to defeat his game's library. Today we'll be looking at DEADLIGHT, developed by Tequila Works and released in 2012 as part of the Xbox Live Arcade Summer of Arcade. It eventually made it to Steam, which is why we're looking at it today. DEADLIGHT was first announced on January 18th, 2012 as an XBLA exclusive, set for release during the annual Summer of Arcade. It released on August 1st, 2012. On October 5th, Tequila Works announced the game would be released to Microsoft Windows via Steam, having sold well on the Xbox Live Arcade. Microsoft Studios published the game, which was being developed by a new company, Tequila Works. Although DEADLIGHT was Tequila Works' debut, the development team included people who had worked on games like Overlord 2, Heavy Rain, Castlevania Lords of Shadow, and even Diablo 3. A demo was made available on March 5th. Speaking of the demo, Eurogamer's Martin Robinson noted the similarity between the movement and animations of DEADLIGHT and classic cinematic platformers such as Another World and Flashback. I've actually played both Another World and Flashback, and yeah, DEADLIGHT is comparable to those two titles. This similarity was an intentional design decision, as director, co-writer and designer, and I'm going to butcher this, Raul Rubio Muñarez explained, quote, "DEADLIGHT is like a game from the 80s in many ways. Not only in the way it's played, but in its story, its look. This type of dystopian tale of doom and gloom is typical of the period at the end of the 70s and early 80s, typified by the work of comic book artists such as Richard Corbin. The solitary figure that wanders the road living his own personal drama. If you combine that with the typical 80s backdrop, the storyline, the analogical aspects, the grey weather, the feeling of loneliness, with this genre often seen in the 80s and 90s, cinematic platformers in which the world is a character itself, you achieve something original, a return to the 80s, not just at a narrative or aesthetic level, but at the level of gameplay itself." Muñarez further explains, "If you remember Prince of Persia or Another World, the animation technique used was rotoscoping. People are filmed first and then their movements are copied. Initially we did the same, recording ourselves on video. For this type of retro game, it was important that the animation was smooth. Characters needed to be dynamic, so we used keyframe animation. If we had used motion capture, the game would have lost that 80s feel." Of the game's graphical style in general, the developers have said, quote, "The game is told through silhouettes, which helps us define the gameplay area. All of the main game area is harsh shadowed 2D, but the landscape and background is very detailed. Because that's how Randall, the protagonist, sees the world. All the characters are shadows of their former selves. Randall himself is living in a dying world, but this world will keep going without him, so the graphics represent how Randall sees what's happening to him." In relation to the game's artistic style, artist, and another one I'm going to butcher, Abel Oros Vincente stated, "The artistic aspect of DEADLIGHT is the foundation upon which the game is largely built. The game is its atmosphere, and the atmosphere is achieved largely thanks to the visuals. The key is in the hyperrealism and the overexposed lighting, which is not hyperrealistic, but we use it as a stylizing tool." 3D artist, and another butchering, Pablo Fernandez Gomez, further explained, "It's a pictorial approach to reality that awakens a certain sensation, and helps the player understand as they play the game. In terms of story, the developers have cited influences such as Richard Matheson's 1954 novel I Am Legend, Stephen King's Cell, Cormac McCarthy's The Road, and Robert Kirkman's comic book series The Walking Dead. This influence is evident, if not entirely on the nose at times. It feels like an alternative version to Season 1 of The Walking Dead TV show. The Steam version features improved graphics and a new Nightmare difficulty mode, something PC gamers love, where the player's progress is not saved. They must complete the game in one go, and if they die at any point, they must return to the start. Think Ultra Nightmare in Doom or any roguelike. In my opinion, playing this game so long after release, its impact is lessened. So far removed from the zombie craze of the early 2010s, it just kind of feels well, boring. The voice acting doesn't help. With the exception of the rat, a survivor who lives in a Saw-like nightmare maze in the sewers, the performances feel wooden. I couldn't connect with Gruff McGrufferson as the protagonist. His story has some compelling moments, sure, but I couldn't care. As for the gameplay, it's boring. The puzzles aren't particularly challenging, and the combat is frustrating. Admittedly, the combat was a conscious design decision, making it more viable to try and outrun the zombies than to stand and fight. If you fight, you will probably die. There was one aspect of the game that I really enjoyed, and that was the cutscenes, done in a barely animated graphic novel style, similar to those Marvel Knights animations from a couple of years ago. You know, frames just sort of shifting, maybe with a bit of shake added to them to give them more action. But on the whole, the game is average. Not bad by any stretch for a debut title from a new studio, but not earth-shattering either. And it's really short. It only took me about 2 hours to complete. And I have to mention a bug that I personally encountered. On my version, even though I was using an Xbox controller, it didn't pick up some of my inputs and I was forced to take my hand off the controller and shoot with a mouse. And that was just an unfortunate pain. So if you absolutely love zombie fiction and have some extra cash and 2 hours to burn, give it a shot. Also, can we all just agree that not calling zombies zombies is stupid? I mean, shadows? Really? Those aren't shadows, they're zombies. Just call them zombies. Also, walkers, infected, biters, abominations, freaks, or whatever, a zombie is a bloody zombie. And that'll just about wrap up this episode of Escape from Mount Backlog. Be sure to like, favorite, and subscribe, and join me next week when we look at something a little more science fiction-y.